all, and welcome back to another episode of There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and today I'm going to bring a fairly well-known case to you guys. It is an English case, so let's get into it, shall we? After rumblings came across the desk of police of a missing daughter being buried in the garden, a warrant was obtained and served at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester. On February 24th, 1994, police got to work searching for Heather West. They uncovered the bones of not one, but two others, starting with the discovery of another person's femur bone. Immediately, Fred West was arrested. He speaks with investigators, and during this time, he slowly makes admissions about the women accidentally admitting to the three bodies in the garden. But before we get to all that, let's talk about the history of this case. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on September 29th, 1941, in Mouchmarkel in Herefordshire Parish, 18 miles northwest of Gloucester. His parents were Walter Stephen and Daisy Hannah West. He was the first son of the couple and the second in the line of 8, though 2 died in infancy. He grew up in a poor but tight-knit family. Fred grew up in a rented house that was just 2 rooms for a long, long time. As the eldest son, he was touted as being Daisy's favorite, and Fred would later claim his family engaged in incest and that his first sexual experience was with his own mother, though these claims are unsubstantiated at best. The locals knew the parents as hardworking and decent. Growing up, Fred was a below-average student in school, struggling to read and write, and Daisy came to Fred's aid any time school became an issue, which of course caused him to be known as a mama's boy and isolated him further from his own peers. The only area he was good at in school was art and woodworking. His Aunt Edna reported that Fred was a cheerful boy that would help the family harvest the crop of hops. After leaving school, Fred even went to work with his father at Frank Brooks' farm, but he did leave within about a year and a half of starting. On November 28th, 1958, 17-year-old Fred was in a motorcycle accident in which he broke his arm, leg, and part of his skull and was in a coma for a week. He required a plate to repair his skull, and his leg ended up being set incorrectly, causing a height difference compared to his other leg, and a permanent limp from then on. He went from being docile to violent, and his emotional control was pretty much gone. He began to shoplift and steal after the incident, likely a result of brain damage. Another notable incident occurred when Fred was at a local youth center, and he put his hand up a girl's skirt that he was speaking to out on the fire escape. She pushed him away, and he fell off the fire escape and was left unconscious on the ground below. He ended up not waking up for 24 hours, after which he supposedly suffered from epileptic episodes. In 1961, Fred was caught attempting to steal a watch strap and cigarette case from a jeweler, for which he was fined. In 1962, the 21-year-old got a 13-year-old pregnant, after which his family wouldn't tolerate his antics anymore and he was kicked out of his family home. At first, he went to live with his sister, but even she kicked him out, and he was pretty much disowned by everyone in his family. In order to survive, Fred took on working as a delivery driver and in construction. While driving, he met Catherine Bernadette Rena Costello. She moved from Scotland, and sources vary on whether she worked as in a cafe known as Milk Bar or was a stripper and a sex worker on the run. Rena was pregnant at the time, and according to her, her father was a Pakistani immigrant who was a bus driver. To make her way out of Scotland, she stole what she needed, resulting in an active search for her. And while the two were riding a bus, the officer of Criminal Investigation Department flagged it down. Fred told the officer that the two were a couple and he was the father. In order to keep up this ruse, the two got married on November 28th, 1962. This was within 4 days of meeting each other, and Rena became Rena West for a time. Rena gave birth to her daughter, Charmaine Carol Mary West, on May 22nd, 1963. Charmaine was biracial, however, and so Fred and Rena claim that after having a miscarriage, the couple decided to adopt. Charmaine's real father was supposedly a pimp who continued to use Rena, and Fred actually got into it too, driving Rena around in the evening after his day job as an ice cream truck driver. Still, the couple remained together, and Rena eventually gave birth to Anne Marie West, Fred's biological daughter. While driving for work one day, Fred met another crying girl. He gave her a free sundae, and Fred invited her to ride along with him. Anne McFall was a 16-year-old who was living with a mother who didn't take care of her. After listening to her plight, Fred offered Anne a place to stay in exchange for taking care of the two young kids that were at home. All continued to go well until November 4th, 1965, when Fred was driving for work and he ran over and killed a 4-year-old with the ice cream truck. While the death was ruled as an accident, Fred feared retaliation from the neighborhood and as such took his children and moved back home to Mooch Markle. Anne followed Fred and continued to be a caregiver. Later, Fred's journal of the time reported that he fell in love with Anne at this time. Eventually, Anne became pregnant, but at 8 months, she disappeared in 1967. It took 30 years for Anne's body to be found in a local field where she had been buried. On November 29th, 1968, Fred met another young girl at a bus stop, 15-year-old Rose Letts. Now, Rosemary, or Rose Letts, was born on November 29th, 1953, to William, or Bill Letts, and Daisy Gwendolyn Letts in Devon, then later moved to Cheltenham and Gloucester. She was the 5th child, and both parents were mentally ill. Her father was schizophrenic and her mother clinically depressed, supposedly receiving electroshock therapy while Rose was in the womb. As a baby, Rose developed a tic, where she rocked violently back and forth. As she got older, she slowed to simply swaying her head back and forth rhythmically. She was slow in school and didn't do well academically. She was sexually abused and beaten by her father, along with her sisters. As such, she quickly learned what it took to remain on his good side, becoming an eventual master manipulator. After puberty, she became addicted to sex. She fondled her own brothers. Then, she looked for as many sexual partners as she could find. She went after older men, and as a result was raped on numerous occasions, including once at 15 years old when she left a Christmas party, walking home. A stranger offered her a lift and she got in the car. Instead of driving her home, he took her to the hills and raped her. Another time was at a bus stop when a man approached her. She reported feeling uneasy and attempted to flee, but the man caught up with her and drug her into a parking lot. Daisy finally left the house in 1968, taking Rose and another daughter with her. Rose was known to have an explosive temper at this point, with aggressive behavior. When she was a teen, she did manage to get a job in the area, and one day returned home to find that everyone else had simply up and left. Rose reported later that this abandonment had a, quote, devastating effect, end quote, on her. At 16, Rose moved back with her father. It was at another bus station that she met Fred. Rose began to trust Fred, though she did keep the relationship hidden from her father. Fred and her shared the same sexual appetite, and after meeting, they immediately formed a strong relationship. Soon, the small family moved into 25 Midland Road in Gloucester. A year later, the now 16-year-old Rose moved in with Fred. On October 17, 1970, Rose gave birth to Heather Ann. 2 months later, on December 4th, Fred was sent to prison after failing to pay several fines that had been accumulating for his continued thefts. During this time, Rose began to beat her 2 stepchildren. Later, Anne Marie would report that during the beatings, Charmaine refused to cry, which of course would intensify her beatings. By June 1971, while Fred was still incarcerated, the 8-year-old Charmaine disappeared. Fred was released shortly after, on June 24th, 1971, and when he returned home, Fred buried Charmaine in the house's coal cellar, then filled it in and built an extension of the kitchen on top of it. When asked about where she had gone, Fred and Rose began telling people Rena had taken her away. But when Rena showed up to visit, that made their story more difficult to believe. So shortly after, Rena herself disappeared. Later, it was learned she was buried in a field out in the Gloucester countryside with her kneecaps and fingers removed. Rose became bored at home and began working out of the family house as a prostitute. She placed advertisement in swinger magazines and often used this as a means to make money. Fred seems to encourage her behavior and created a peephole to watch. The two began prowling for women at this time as well. Elizabeth Agnes, a neighbor, would babysit the children at times. The couple openly admitted to her that they used this time to prowl for young girls, preferring virgins. One night, Fred propositioned Elizabeth, and after she refused, the couple drugged her and raped her as well. Rose was pregnant again at the end of 1971, and the two decided it was best if they got married. And so on January 29th, 1972, the two said, "I do." Rose was now Rosemary West, and Rose gave birth to their second daughter, Mae West, on June 1st, 1972. Deciding they needed more room, the family moved to 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester. Things didn't change much with the move, however. Fred continued to work as a driver and construction worker, while Rose used the new home to continue sex work. But with all the children in the house, the couple needed someone to watch them. In October of 1972, they hired a nanny, Carolyn Owens, a 17-year-old. However, after being propositioned several times, Carolyn left. On December 6, 1972, Fred and Rose happened upon her as she was hitchhiking down the road. They pulled over and yelled at her to get in the car. She froze and ended up being bound and abducted. According to Carolyn herself, on the night she went out with her boyfriend, and she was picked up. On the way home, she was beaten and she passed out. When she was brought back to the home, Fred and Rose undressed, gagged, and bound her, and she was thrown on a mattress on the floor, then sexually assaulted. The assault continued until the morning. Then she was thrown into the cellar. Carol managed to escape and went to authorities, but the magistrate mishandled the kidnapping, imprisonment, and sexual assault, and in the end, the couple was simply forced to pay a 25-pound fine. And that was it. There were no other repercussions for this. As Anne Marie turned 18, Fred and Rose West began to notice her more. They led her to the cellar where she was bound and gagged, telling her she needed to know how to satisfy her husband before being raped by Fred. She was threatened into silence, suffering at the hands of her parents for years before she managed to escape the home. On April 19, 1973, the West took in Linda Go. She was a 15-year-old who had dropped out of school and was working as a seamstress. When she left her family home, she wrote a note stating that she was moving to 25 Cromwell Street. After days of not hearing from her, her family went to the address, and reportedly Rose answered the door in Linda's robe and slippers. But she simply told the family that while Linda had been there for days, she had left to find work outside of Gloucester. Linda was later found dismembered with her fingers, toes, and kneecaps removed. Fred had buried her in the ground floor bathroom of the house. In August of 1973, the West's first son, Stephen, was born. On November 10, 1973, Carol, or Kaz, Ann Cooper, a 15-year-old, was out with her friends. She went to see a movie, after which she was going to spend the weekend with her grandmother. Carol was last seen getting onto a bus in Warden at 9:10 p.m. She was reported missing after she didn't arrive at her grandmother's that evening. Still, she wouldn't be found until the search of 25 Cromwell Street, where she was located in the cellar with her fingers, toes, and kneecaps also removed. On December 27, 1973, Lucy Catherine Partington, a 21-year-old student at Exeter University, came home to visit family for Christmas break. She left her home to visit a friend in Pittville at approximately 10 p.m. and was last seen on Evesham Road. When she didn't return home the next day, she too was reported missing. There was nothing. She was also found in the cellar, dismembered, with her fingers, toes, and kneecaps removed. Fred managed to injure himself during the dismemberment, it seems, as he went to the hospital on January 3rd for a deep cut of his own. In April of 1974, Therese Singenthaler, a 21-year-old from Switzerland, who was in England studying sociology at Woolwich College of Further Education in London. The week before Easter, she left her housing and began hitchhiking towards Ireland. But after Easter break, she failed to return to school, and she was reported missing on April 26, 1974. She would also be later found in the cellar, dismembered with her fingers, toes, and kneecaps removed. 15-year-old Shirley Hubbard was the next victim. She was a student at Droitwich High School and worked at a general store in Worcester. On November 14, 1974, she left work and was never seen again. She was also recovered from the cellar. In her case, her head was covered in tape, and a pair of plastic tubes was inserted in her nostrils. Her remains were found with a shatter pattern that followed along with one of Fred's admissions that he used an axe to dismember her. Juanita Marion Mott was a 15-year-old runaway. She had previously lived with the Wests, but at the time of her disappearance, she was living with a friend in Newent. On April 11, 1975, she went to the house and promised to be back the next day. When she didn't return, the family contacted the Missing Persons Bureau, and Juanita, it seems, was likely tortured as well. Gagged with a nylon stocking and then trussed up with a washing line that was looped around her limbs and crisscrossing horizontally and vertically around her torso and head. Then a noose was made and she was suspended from the ceiling. After she passed away, she was dismembered as well. Rose gave birth to another child in December of 1977, though she was clearly not Fred's, as she was biracial. Her name was Tara. In April of 1978, Shirley Ann Robinson, a 19-year-old sex worker who had been staying with the Wests, went missing. She had been with the Wests for months and was pregnant herself. It's unclear exactly when or why she was killed, but she was dismembered with her fingers, toes, and kneecaps removed. After putting 6 bodies in the cellar, however, Shirley needed somewhere to go, and she was the first to be buried in the back garden. After this, Rose gave birth to Louise West in November of 1978. Allison Jane Chambers was a 16-year-old that was considered a troubled teen. She was moved from her home to Jordensbrook House. She was given a job working as a youth training scheme for a solicitor's office in the city, and she was last seen in August of 1979. Her disappearance quickly reported by the house she lived in. On May 26, 1979, Allison wrote home to let them know she was staying with a family, taking care of their children and helping with some of the house chores. She thought of them like a second family and sounded happy to be there. Allison lived for a time at 25 Cromwell Street. A friend of Allison, Sharon Compton, was brought in by Allison under the guise of acceptance. But within weeks, both were forced to engage in sexual activities. Sharon ran, but Allison did not. After her death, The killing seemingly ceased for about 8 years. At that time, Fred got his own child, Anna Marie, pregnant, though the pregnancy is ectopic and as such was terminated. Anna was 15 at the time, and after this, she moved out to live with her boyfriend. So Fred's attention shifted to Heather and May. Stephen wasn't immune, being initiated by his mother at around age 13 as well. And Rose also continued to physically abuse her children. She would tie their hands and beat them with a belt or length of rope. She even strangled one of her sons, leaving bruising around his neck. In June of 1987, 17-year-old Heather Ann West disappeared. When Fred disposed of her, Stephen came out and asked why Fred was digging up the yard. Purportedly, Fred told Stephen that he was planning on putting in a fish pond. So Stephen, being a great son, helped dig the hole. Surprised to see it filled in pretty much the next day, Fred then built a patio over the site. And Fred and Rose began telling their children that Heather left to work in Devon, but then reported that she ran off to be with a lesbian lover. Fred eventually started telling the kids that they would end up being buried under the patio like Heather if they were bad. Stephen said Rose would often lose her temper at this time. Quote, "Once she started hitting us, I felt she found it hard to stop." End quote. The killing ended with Heather, but the beatings and molestation did not. In 1992, the then 14-year-old Tara made friends and eventually told some of the abuse that was occurring at the hands of her parents. That Fred had pornographic videos and showed them to Rose and the kids. This friend ended up telling her parents, and on August 4th, 1992, those parents went to police. 2 days later, the warrant was served, in which a ton of pornography was found, along with proof of rape and sodomy at the hands of Fred. Even enough to charge Rose with assisting in the abuse of a minor. The 5 younger West kids were taken into custody of social services and housed temporarily at Cowley Manor in Cheltenham. For these charges, Fred and Rose went to trial in June of 1993. But after Tara refused to testify, the case started to fall apart and the parents were free to go. Social services did keep the children out of their custody for a time. And during this time, several workers heard the children talking about how Fred and Rose would talk about Heather being buried under the patio. At first, they thought it was a joke, but soon thought it might have some weight to it, and so the social workers informed police. Finally, it all came to an end when police came to the door of the Wests again on February 24th, 1994. By this time, the kids were back in the home, and it was Stephen who answered. He retrieved his mother, who in turn called Fred, who was out at work. Fred, though, didn't return home from his construction site, though he was called at 1:40 p.m. Instead, he showed up at the police station around 7:40, and he said that Heather had run away with her lesbian girlfriend, a sentiment repeated by Rose back at home. Fred then went home and walked the dogs with Rose. The next day, the police showed up to get to work excavating the garden, and Fred told them to take him in, admitting to killing Heather and burying her in the garden, even telling them where to dig, as it was a different place from where they were originally broke ground. From there, Fred began giving confessions of his sort, that he had killed Heather after getting angry at something he overheard. Fred reported that he throttled her. He didn't intend to kill her, but simply wanted to keep her quiet. Then he described how he disposed of Heather's body, stating that he had taken her into the bathroom and garroted her with a nylon rope. Then he cut her up in the bathtub before burying her. In the background, police were excavating the site, delayed when they burst a sewer pipe. It took until approximately 4 p.m. when police found a bone. As they continued, more remains came out, and when they were taken to Professor Bernard Knight, the home office pathologist, he stated, quote, "Either this lady had 3 legs, or we're looking at more than one body," end quote, after realizing there was a 3rd femur in the set of remains. Police brought this information back to Fred, who then admitted to killing Shirley Robinson, stating she was buried during the bright moonlight night. Shirley Robinson was pregnant Shirley Robinson was the pregnant teen that was killed. A piece of flex was used and tied around her. According to Fred, he murdered her after she threatened to tell Rose that she was pregnant with Fred's child. At the time she was killed, Rose was in the hospital, giving birth. At that time, Fred accidentally said she was the third before attempting to correct himself, saying 2. Though police did keep digging and indeed found that there were 3 women in the garden. On February 27th, Fred was charged with the murder of his daughter Heather West, and at the same time Rose was let out on bail. At this time, Fred continued to insist he was the only one involved in any of these crimes. After Shirley was found and her remains were consistent with Fred's story, Fred was charged with her murder and that of Allison Chambers on March 2nd. After consideration, police believe that the 3 were buried outside the home because of overflow. It was time to go into the home and search everywhere, starting in the cellar. Eventually, 6 more sets of remains were found, brought up in little black boxes. The process was slow, as parts of the house had to be filled with concrete, as other areas were dug up in order to preserve the structural integrity of the house. Then another shift. First, when Anne's remains were found, and second, when Rose was brought to court. Fred attempted to touch Rose, and Rose seemingly shirked him off twice during this process. After this, Fred was pissed, and he attempted to subtly change the tone of his admissions. Fred stated, quote, "I have not and still not told you the whole truth about these matters. From the very first day of this inquiry, my main concern has been to protect other person or persons, and there is nothing else I wish to say at this time." End quote. Over weeks, however, the blame began to shift towards Rose. After believing that all of the bodies had been recovered, Fred and Rose West were charged with 9 joint counts of murder on September 22, 1994, after which Fred began acting erratically. And on New Year's Day, 1995, Fred was found dead after he hung himself in his cell with his bedsheet. He was 53 years old, and he left behind many, many unanswered questions. Still, Rosemary was alive, and on January 13th, the murder of Charmaine West was added to the list of her murders. In May 1995, she pleaded not guilty to all charges. By October 3rd of that year, her trial began. After multiple victims of abuse that were left alive testified, including Anne Marie West and Carolyn Owens, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Rose was guilty on 10 counts of murder. The judge handed out a life sentence for each of the murders and recommended she never be released. 18 months later, the Home Secretary agreed with the recommendation, and the now 42-year-old received a quote-unquote whole life sentence. According to biography.com, quote, Rose immediately refused to accept her fate and launched appeals in 1996 and 2000. She claimed variously that new exculpatory evidence had come to light, then that huge media interest had prevented her from receiving a fair trial. The 1996 appeal was rejected, and in 2001, Rose announced she would no longer be appealing her case, but maintained her innocence. She remains incarcerated in a prison in West Yorkshire. Rose was again in the focus of media attention in January 2003 when it was claimed that she was to marry Dave Glover, the bass player of a rock group Slade, following a courtship via letters. Glover disputed that there was an engagement and said the media attention over his letters to Rose had cost him his position in the band. End quote. In October of 1996, 25 Cromwell Street was demolished. And with that, that ends the case of Fred and Rose West and the atrocities that occurred there. To all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.